Configuring FTP Sites on IIS 6. The File Transfer Protocol, or FTP as it's more commonly referred to, is a method of providing remote access to a server in order to be able to upload as well as download files. IIS 6 supports FTP straight out of the box, so you don't need any special software other than the Windows Server 2003 operating system. But by default, the FTP service is not installed, even when you've installed IIS 6. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and install FTP on our server. So we'll click on Start, Control Panel, Add or Remove Programs. And then we'll come over here and choose Add Remove Windows Components. Now FTP is part of IIS, as you already know, and IIS is an application server role. So we'll double click on Application Server and then we'll double click on Internet Information Services. Now here we can see the File Transfer Protocol, or FTP service, so we'll place a check in this box and then we'll click on OK, OK, and then Next. Now make sure that you do have your Windows Server 2003 CD in your drive, as it will need some files from the CD. Now I'll just pause this video and we'll return once the files have copied across. Okay, we're done. FTP's now been installed on our server, so we'll click Finish and we'll just close this down. Now at this point, before we start attempting to connect to our server or add files and directories, we should in fact verify that the FTP service has been properly started and there weren't any problems. So we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the Services MMC. Now if we scroll down, we can see the FTP publishing service has started. Now it's this FTP publishing service that enables your server to become an FTP server. So it's pretty important that this service is running. After all, no FTP service means no FTP server. Now if you do have problems with this service and it won't start, it's a good idea to cast your eyes below to the IIS admin service and make sure that this one's also started, because the FTP publishing service is dependent on this IIS admin service being up and running, and you can verify that by right clicking on the FTP service. We'll select Properties and we'll come over here to the Dependencies tab. And you can see here that the FTP publishing service does in fact depend on the IIS admin service being started first. Now alternatively, you can actually verify this information. I'll just click Cancel here. If we were to go to our IIS admin service and then click Stop, you can see that we're presented with a dialog box that shows us the services that are dependent on the IIS admin service. So you can see here that the FTP publishing service will be stopped if we do stop our IIS admin service. Alright, now in our case everything's obviously installed fine, so we'll move on. So we'll go and click on Start, My Computer, and we'll navigate to our C drive. Now most users of IIS would already be familiar with IIS's default directory, which is the inetpub directory. So if we go into our inetpub directory, you can see now that we have an FTP root directory. And as the name suggests, this FTP root directory does serve as our root drive for all of our FTP sites. Okay, so let's move on and we'll take a look at configuring FTP on our server. So we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the Internet Information Services MMC. Now I'll just expand this to make it a little bit easier to see. Now under our server, Server 01, if we expand this plus icon here, we can see we have a folder called FTP Sites. If we select FTP Sites, in the right hand pane we can see all of the FTP sites that we currently have. Now by default, we are given one FTP site when we install FTP on our server, and that's quite obviously the default FTP site. Now next to the description of our FTP site, we see a numerical value which is the identifier for this FTP site. We can see the state of our FTP site, which is currently running, the IP address which is associated to our FTP site, and on which port it's configured on. And we can see that it's currently using the default FTP port of port 21. Now if we right click on our default website, you can see here we've got quite a few options. The first option, Explore, simply refreshes the contents of this FTP site and shows the results in the right hand pane here. So if I click on Explore, you can see that our default FTP site, in the right hand side, we'll see all of the items that we have contained in our default FTP site, which is currently empty, as you can see. Now if we right click again on our default FTP site, Open simply opens up Windows Explorer at the root of our FTP site. So you can see here that it opens up at C inetpub/FTP root, which of course is the path to our default FTP site. Now I'm just quickly going to create something in this FTP site, so I'm going to right click and just create a new directory, and I'll just call this one 1. Now we can close this down now. Now over here on the right hand side, you can see that our default FTP site does contain a directory called 1. Okay, if we right click again, our next option here is permissions, and this is where we can set which users have rights to read or write to our FTP directory. Now bear in mind, these are NTFS permissions to the default FTP directory, which you can see at the top of this dialog box here is to our C inetpub FTP root directory. So you can simply click on Add and add in any users you like, and then assign the appropriate permissions at the bottom. Okay, our next option here is Browse, and this basically performs the same task as Explore we looked at a moment ago. Then we have options to start, stop or pause our FTP service. Now on the new flyout menu, we can create a new FTP site from a file, a new virtual directory, or we can create a virtual directory from a file, but we'll get to these options in a moment. Now on our All Tasks menu, we can save the configuration of our FTP site to a file. Now this is really useful if you're building a few FTP sites that need to have the same configuration. You can simply choose this option, save the configuration, and restore that configuration to any other servers. Now the first thing you're going to have to do is provide a file name. So I'm just going to call this one FTP config. And we can see the default path of where our configuration file will be saved, which is in our system32 directory in the inetserv folder. Now you can change this if you wish, but I'll just leave these defaults here. And finally, we can choose to encrypt the configuration file by checking this box, and we'll need to enter in a password, and we'll do it again just to confirm that password, and then we'll click on OK. Now unfortunately we don't get any feedback that the configuration file was actually written to disk, but we can easily check that by going to My Computer, our C drive, our Windows folder, we'll scroll down, select System32, followed by our inetserv directory, and here we can see our configuration file, which is like most configuration files in IIS, it's based on XML. Okay, our other options here on our right click menu are to delete our FTP site, rename it, and of course we can refresh the site. And finally down the bottom here we have the properties of our FTP site. Now before we get stuck into looking at the properties of our FTP site, we'll go back and we'll create a new FTP site. But first, I'm just going to right click on our existing one and choose Delete. So now we'll right click on FTP sites and we'll select New and we'll choose FTP site. But do note here that we can use a configuration file like the one we just saved. So that's where you'd use that option. So we'll click on FTP site and this starts up the new FTP site creation wizard. So we'll just click Next. And the first thing we'll need to do is provide a description for our site. So I'm just going to call this one Test, and then we'll click Next. Now we need to configure our site to listen on a specific IP address. Now the default here is to use all unassigned network adapters, or we could just choose a specific one. Now we only have a single network card in this server, so it's kind of a moot point for us. But if you have a specific network adapter you want to use for this site, you can select it from this drop-down box. So I'll just leave the default here at all unassigned, and we'll leave the default FTP port at port 21. Then we'll choose Next, and here's one of the greatest features of FTP on IIS 6. Here's where we can choose whether we want to allow users to be able to access our FTP site as one directory structure that everyone sees, or we can isolate each individual user that logs on so that they only see their own folder. You can think of this as like a home folder on a regular Windows network for each FTP user. Now the default is to not use FTP isolation, and it basically means that every user logging in will have the same home directory. So for now we'll leave the default at Do Not Isolate Users, and we'll come back and take a look at these other options later. so we'll choose Next. And then we have to enter in a path to our home directory. So we'll simply click on Browse, we'll go to our C drive, our inet pub, our FTP root directory, and we'll leave that as our default root directory, and we'll choose OK, and we can see that that path has now been put here, and we'll choose Next. And now we get to choose what sort of permissions we want to have for our users accessing our FTP site. Now the default, as you can see, is read, so our users will be able to FTP into our FTP server and then read the contents of the directory. But we can also allow them to write files to our directory if we wish. Now I'll just leave these two here and we'll choose Next, and we're done, so we'll choose Finish, and we can see our test FTP site has been created. So if we go back here to FTP sites, we can see our description of test has been created, the identifier, the state is running, we're currently running on all IP addresses, and we're running on port 21. Okay, so let's go and test our FTP server. So we'll come down here and click on Start, and we'll open up a command prompt. Now as you recall, we chose to not isolate any of our users. So regardless of which user logs into our FTP server, they're all going to land in the same directory. Now we can illustrate this by typing in FTP followed by the IP address of our server, and we'll hit enter. And now we need to type in a username and password. So for the username, we'll simply enter in anonymous and a password, and you can see that we're logged in. Now the password, by the way, here for the anonymous user really doesn't have to be anything specific, so you can enter in anything, just hit enter and you'll be allowed in. Okay, so we're logged into our FTP server. Now we can simply type in ls, and that's the Windows equivalent of dir, and this will return a listing of what's inside this directory. Okay, here we can see the folder 1 that we created earlier, so we know that we're in the right place. But let's go and open up a new command prompt, and we'll do the same thing again. We'll FTP into our server 168.0.11, and this time we'll enter in the administrator account. And this time, because we are using a valid account, we will need to enter in the real password for this account. So we'll type in the administrator's password and hit enter. We can see the administrator's logged in. So again, we'll type in ls. And here we can see the folder 1's there again, showing us that we're in exactly the same place. So this demonstrates that everyone who logs into our FTP server will find themselves in the same folder as everyone else. Okay, so that's the do not isolate users option. Now the next option we had was to isolate users. Okay, we'll go back to our IIS MMC. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to delete our existing FTP site. And we'll right click again on FTP sites. We'll select new, FTP site. We'll select next on our wizard. Again, I'm just going to call this site test and click next. Our IP address we'll leave as all unassigned, and our port we'll leave at port 21 and choose next. This time we'll choose to isolate our users. Now when we do isolate users using this option, we do need to direct each unique user that logs on to a specific directory. So the first thing we're going to have to do is to create these directories, because if we don't, our users will be denied access to our FTP server. So if we go back to our Explorer and navigate to our FTP root folder, we'll need to right click and we'll create a new folder. Now we'll call this folder local user. Now inside this folder, we need to create folders for each of the users we wish to log onto our FTP site. So again, we'll right click, we'll select new folder, and we'll call this first folder public, and this folder is going to be for our anonymous users. And then we'll go and create another folder, and we'll call this one administrator. Now to make this easier to identify which directory we've landed in, I'm going to go to our administrators folder, I'm going to right click, select new, and I'll create a new text document, and I'll just call this one admin.txt. Okay, if we go back to our wizard and choose next, we need to provide the path to our root directory of our FTP site. So again, we'll click on browse, we'll navigate to a C, inet pub, FTP root, and then we'll choose OK. Now we'll choose next, and finally we have to decide what sort of permissions we want to allow each user to have. Now seeing as we've isolated users from each other, we'll allow both read and write access. Although do bear in mind that this will allow our anonymous users to be able to write to the public folder. Okay, so we'll click on Next, we'll click on Finish, and we can see that our new FTP site has been added. If we click on FTP Sites, we can see that this one does have a unique identifier. So we'll go back to our command prompt and we'll log in again. So we'll choose Start, Command Prompt, and we'll FTP to 192.168.0.11, and we'll enter in a username of administrator and the password for the administrator account, and we can see that the administrator has successfully logged in. So again, we'll type in ls, and here we can see the admin.txt file that we created inside the admin's home folder. So there you can identify that we are in fact inside the administrator's directory. Now, a word of warning here: if you happen to be running your FTP server on a domain controller, then you'll get a 530 error here telling you that the home directory is inaccessible. And you'll also get the same 530 error if under your FTP root you did not create this local user folder. So all your subfolders need to be underneath the local user folder. Otherwise your users will be denied access. Okay, now this brings us to our final option, which is to create an FTP site using Active Directory user isolation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a different server that I've pre-installed Active Directory on. Okay, so here we are in our Windows 2003 domain controller. So we'll come back over here to FTP Sites, we'll right click, select New, FTP Site. Again, we'll choose Next. We'll type a description, we'll just call ours Test again, we'll choose Next. We'll leave the default IP address at all unassigned and the default TCP port for our FTP site at port 21, and we'll choose Next. Now we'll choose the bottom option here to isolate users using Active Directory. So again, we'll choose Next. Now we're asked to provide an account which we'll use to locate our user's FTP home directory in Active Directory. So for our purposes, we'll simply use the administrator account. So I'll click on Browse, Advanced, Find Now, select the administrator account, choose OK, OK again, and we can see that our administrator account has been populated in this box. Now we'll need to enter in the password for the administrator account, and we'll enter in the default Active Directory domain. So if we click on Browse, we'll see our only domain is testdomain.com, so we'll choose that, choose OK, we'll choose Next, and we'll be asked to reconfirm our administrator's password, so we'll type that in now and choose OK. And finally we get to assign the permissions that we want to these directories, so we'll allow read and write, and we'll choose Next and Finish. Okay, now what we've told IIS to do is to redirect FTP users to their FTP home directory. But right at this moment, that directory does not exist. So what we'll do is we'll quickly run through how to set this up. So we'll open up My Computer, and we'll go to our C drive, we'll right click, we'll create a new folder, and I'll just call this folder Home. And now I'll right click on our home folder and select Sharing and Security. I'll elect to share this folder, and I'll share this as home, that's fine, that's the default name. We'll go to our permissions button and we'll assign everybody full control. So we'll choose OK and OK again. And now we'll go and open up Active Directory Users and Computers, and we'll go to our Users OU and we'll right click and we'll create a new user account. Now I'll just call this user Bob and a surname of Jones, and I'll give him a UPN of bjones@testdomain.com. We'll choose Next. We need to enter in a password for Bob's account, and we'll just confirm that again. And for this account, I'm going to uncheck User Must Change Password, and I'm going to leave it at Password Never Expires. We'll choose Next and Finish. Now we'll right click on Bob's account and we'll choose Properties, and we'll come up here to the Profile tab. Now under his home folder, we'll choose the Connect button and create a home folder for Bob. So we'll enter in the path of our server, which is server01/home/%, username %, and then we'll choose OK. Now if we go to our C drive again and inside our home directory, you'll see a folder has been created for Bob. So we'll just open up his folder for the moment, and we'll right click, we'll select a new text document, and we'll just call this one bob.txt so we can identify when Bob has successfully logged in to his own home FTP directory. Now we're not quite ready to log Bob in yet. If we try it now, it won't work. What we need to do is tell Active Directory about this folder which will be used for Bob to FTP into. So we'll open up a command prompt and we'll type in IIS ftp.vbs. Now if you add a /? At the end of this command, you can see a list of all the available options you have. But the two that we're actually interested in here are the Set Active Directory Properties switch and the Get Active Directory Properties switch. So if we type in IIS ftp.vbs, followed by the Get AD Properties switch, and then followed by B Jones, the response which should come back should be null. And that's because we haven't yet populated Active Directory with Bob's information. So we'll type in IIS ftp.vbs followed by the Set AD Properties switch, of course followed by the name of Bob Jones, and we'll set his FTP directory to B Jones. And we can see that the FTP directory for the user Bob Jones has been set to B Jones, which is of course the folder that we created for him earlier. Now we need to set what the root of our FTP site is. So this time we'll type in IIS ftp.vbs. Again, we'll use the Set AD Properties switch, and for our user B Jones, we're going to set the FTP root to the shared home folder we created earlier, which of course is on server 01/home. And we'll hit enter, and we can see that the FTP root directory for Bob Jones has been set to server 01/home. Okay, so now we're done. Now we'll try and log in using Bob's account and we can test our work. So from our command prompt, we'll enter in FTP 192.168.0.11, and we'll enter in the username of B Jones and the password for Bob, and we can see that user Bob Jones has logged in. So if we type in ls, we can see the bob.txt file that we created up here a moment ago. Alright, we've now looked at the three methods of FTP access on IIS 6. So let's take a closer look at the properties of our FTP sites. So we'll go back to our IIS MMC and we'll right click on our test FTP site and select properties. Now as you can see at the top, we have three tabs here. Now if you're at all familiar with IIS 6, you may wonder where the other two tabs, namely the security accounts and home directory tabs, have disappeared to. Well, we'll quickly go and create a new FTP site to show you the difference. So we'll right click, select new FTP site, again we'll select new, we'll have a description, we'll just call this one test 2 and hit next. We'll just change the FTP port to say 2121 and we'll choose next. We'll choose to not isolate users and we'll choose the default path again of our C, inet pub, FTP root, we'll click OK, next, and we'll leave these defaults and click finish. Now if we go and right click on our test 2 and select properties, you can see we do in fact have 5 tabs at the top. So if we just bring our other one up here, we can see the difference. Now the reason that our Active Directory isolated users FTP site only has 3 tabs is that the home directory is set in Active Directory individually for each user. So we don't need that here because we're not setting a global home directory. We also don't need the security tab as we're using the user's credentials to access the directory. Okay, well let's go through the properties of test 2 rather than test because we can cover all of the tabs here in the one go. Firstly, on the FTP site tab, we can set the site description, the IP address and the port, which we've already seen, but you can certainly modify those here if you wish. Next, we can set how many simultaneous connections we'll allow to our FTP site. The default, as you can see, is set to 100,000 simultaneous connections, but you can certainly change that value to whatever number you like, or you can just set it to unlimited. Now, once this number here is exceeded, any additional users will be denied access. We can also see that idle connections after 2 minutes will be terminated. And at the bottom here we can see that logging is enabled. Now it's a good idea to leave this box checked We'll discuss logging in greater detail in other videos on IIS, so I'm not going to go further into that here, but for quick reference, if you click on Properties, you can see the path here where your log files are saved and the log names that they'll be saved under. Now finally, under Current Sessions, we can see who's currently logged on to our FTP server. Now if you do want to disconnect a user for some reason, you can simply highlight the user in this list and then click on Disconnect. Alternatively, if you want to kick everyone off your server, you can simply choose the Disconnect All and every user will be disconnected from your server. Now on the Security Accounts tab, this is where we set which account has privileges to access content on behalf of our anonymous users. Now if you don't want anonymous users to access your FTP server at all, you can simply uncheck this box. Alternatively, if you only want to allow access to anonymous users, then you can check this box here down the bottom. Now take note of the account here that's used to access resources anonymously, because if you seem to be getting a lot of access denied messages when trying to access content, then make sure that this account has the ability to access the files and folders that it needs. Now on the Messages tab, we can set display messages that users see when they access your FTP site. In fact, we'll duck over here to our Test FTP server and to our Messages tab, and we'll enter in some details here so we can demonstrate what happens when Bob logs back in. Now the first field here is for the banner message. Now the banner message is simply text that the user will see before they enter in their username and password. So we'll just enter in here, Test FTP Site. Now the welcome message is what the user will see when they're first authenticated. So we'll just type in a message like hello. Now our exit message is displayed when a user terminates their session, so we'll just enter in bye. And finally, we can set what text we want to display when a user login is denied because there's too many users already logged on. So I'll just enter in too many users. Now before I click on OK here, I'm just going to go back to our FTP Site tab, and I'm going to change my site connections to be limited to 1. So we'll click on OK. So now we'll go and open up another command prompt and we'll FTP back into our server of 192.168.0.11. Now here we can see our banner message has already appeared next to this 220, our test FTP site. This is before we've actually authenticated our user. So now we'll type in the username of B Jones and the password. And here we can see our welcome message of hello. Now before I exit this FTP session, I'm going to go and click Start, open up another command prompt, and I'm going to FTP into our FTP site again. And here you can see now we're denied with the message too many users, and that's of course because in our FTP site tab we set our maximum connections to 1. So if we go back here and now type in quit, and we can see our exit message of bye. Alright, now back here over to our home directory tab, this is where we can specify which directory is used for our FTP site. Now of course we set that earlier to inetpub FTP root, and we can click on browse and change that if we wish, but we can also have it come from a different location, such as a network drive, by specifying a UNC path and selecting this second option here. So if we choose a directory located on another computer, we can see that we have to enter in a server name followed by the share name. Now we can also see the permissions for the folder, which of course is read, write, and the default is also to log the visits when anyone accesses our FTP site. Now finally, we can choose whether to use Unix or MS-DOS style directory listings when we do an LS. Now our final tab is the Directory Security tab, and this allows us to either allow or deny access to people trying to access our FTP site. Now the default behaviour is to allow access to all computers, but we can certainly change it if we wish by choosing deny. But we can also grant or deny access to a more specific subset of computers if we wish by clicking on add and then entering in a specific IP address, or we can specify a group of computers by entering in a network ID and subnet mask. Now because our default behaviour here is to grant access, any exceptions we make will automatically be listed as denied, and that's rather logical. So if we choose a simple computer and we'll choose an IP address of 192 168.0.2 and we'll choose the DNS lookup button. We can see the DNS name comes back, so we'll choose OK and OK again. And we can see now that our 192.168.0.2 computer will be denied access to our FTP server. Okay, so that's the properties of an FTP server. The final thing we should take a look at here with regards to FTP is virtual directories. Like with websites, our FTP sites can also take advantage of virtual directories. So what is a virtual directory? Well, a virtual directory is simply a directory that can be placed almost anywhere, but appears to a user that it's directly part of the FTP site path. So let's illustrate what I mean. So we'll click cancel on this for the moment and we'll go back here to our IIS MMC and we'll right click on our test FTP site and we'll select new virtual directory, which of course starts up another wizard, so we'll simply click next. Now the first thing we need to do is give our directory a name, so I'll just call this one new. Next we'll need to provide a path to our physical directory. Now this can be a UNC path pointing to a share on a different computer if you like, but I'll just create a new directory at the root of my C drive by clicking on Browse. I'll go to my C drive, I'll choose to make a new folder, and I'll just call this folder Data, and choose OK. And if I open up Windows Explorer and navigate to my C drive and my data folder I've just created, and we'll just create a new file in here. We'll just create a new bitmap image. And now we'll go back to our wizard and we'll just complete the remaining steps by clicking Next. We'll allow read and write permissions to our virtual directory. We'll choose Next and Finish. And over here under our test FTP site, we can see the new virtual directory has been created. So to see our virtual directory in action, we'll go back to our command prompt and we'll enter in FTP followed by the IP address of our server. We'll enter in the username of B Jones and the password for Bob. And we can see that Bob's logged in. If we type in ls, we can see that we are in Bob's home directory with our bob.txt file. But now if we type in cd to change the directory and we type in cd new and hit enter, we can see that change working directory command has completed successfully. So now we're inside the new virtual directory, which we can simply verify by typing in ls, and we can see the new bitmap image that we just created a moment ago. And that's the advantage of virtual directories. They can be located practically anywhere, but appear as if they're located directly within the path of the local site. You'll also notice that even though our real directory is called data, Bob thinks it's called new, and that's because that's the alias that we gave our virtual directory. So there you have virtual directories. They're very, very simple to implement. And if we go and right click on our virtual directory, you can see we can set individual permissions and options for that directory, just as we saw for the test FTP site. So you can set permissions here as well if you want to provide different options for this directory. Okay, in this video we've discussed the configuration of FTP sites in IIS 6 in a lot of depth. We've looked at non-isolated sites, isolated sites, and Active Directory isolated sites. Configuring FTP under Windows Server 2003's IIS 6, it's really easy and incredibly flexible, so take the time to play with FTP and become familiar with it.